as law enforcement officers, how do you see the role that law enforcement can play above the narrative that's being created of polarity to kind of stir in a realization? I mean, we're having conversations, but what else might that look like?
Or did it themselves. Um, but at the end of the day, you just have to remember that God made that person just like He made you. They might have made some choices that just absolutely had your blood boiling at one point when you're sitting here looking at somebody's life who tragically ended, but in reality, um, they're still a human. You know, you don't go into that room and just start throwing things at them and yelling at them. I mean, that's not going to improve anybody. You know, you can't bring back what they've done. You just have to move forward. But that was always the biggest thing I'd say for me is just talk to people like you would want them to talk to you if you're on the other side of it, and try and empathize with how they probably feel. Um, and there've been other hot button issues throughout the past. I'll use kind of another example. In recent years, guns were a big topic of debate, especially amongst a certain segment of society. I don't want to label people, but there's certain people who are very, very vehement about that issue. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that either, but you'd come across those same individuals who physically look exactly like me, so it's nothing to do with race or anything like that, and you could sense the seething hatred of you because you represented the threat to their liberty and their livelihood. And I distinctly remember this one guy, kind of abruptly telling me when we were just talking on the street, he was like, just so you know, I've got a gun. And I think he was almost looking for an issue. And I was like, that's cool, man. I mean, that is entirely your right. And I appreciate you taking the time to make me aware of that. And immediately, because I treated him like a human and didn't start yelling for him to, get on the ground and remove it from him in, some big show of a fashion, I saw him like almost physically take himself back and was like, maybe this guy isn't a bad guy. Maybe he's not here to trot on my liberties like I have this image in my mind. Maybe he's just doing a job, just like we all go to work. And we had a completely positive interaction. And I'm not saying anybody should sacrifice officer safety when the need arises, but in that circumstance, I could tell that somebody who was looking at me with this, I could feel like the burning in his hatred. I was the government, the authority, whatever have you, and that was the enemy to him. I started speaking to him in a normal tone, and by the end of it, it was like, all right, appreciate your time, take care, hope you have a good afternoon, and he was equally as amicable with me, and it goes a long way.
Yeah. What do you see? Well, yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on your comments, I mean, you do have to take it at an individual level and treating people equally and with respect. I mean, I think it goes a long way, like you said, not just with your suspects, but with the victims. And I mean, the victims' families, even the suspects' families, that if you treat them the right way and they appreciate that. For me, I think the short answer to how do we solve this as law enforcement is I don't know that I know yet. And I think I think that's why this is the good part of the protest. This is forcing me as a law enforcement officer to sit back and think about, where I'm at and how and the people I interact with. I'm usually too late to the game when it comes to if I'm trying to steer someone in the right direction. It's usually already gone down a different path and I'm picking up the pieces. And that's the hard part of where I'm at is yes, I'm trying to keep the community safe, and I think I'm getting justice for the victims of these crimes, and I'm protecting the communities that are in from further violence. But I'm searching my heart for ways, for myself personally, how we can try to steer this off at an earlier level. And I mean, for me personally, it could be any long, but there are prevention programs, whether it's education or mentoring or things like that I haven't worked through yet in my mind how this would play out. But yes, and I think I guess why I appreciate even the opportunity here to have a conversation is I think there's and maybe it's a misperception on my part that if you're a white male and you're a white male in law enforcement, you don't have a voice in solving problems or fixing this problem. And like I want to help. I mean, I think I think a lot of police officers want to do the right thing, and we can acknowledge if we've done wrong. And I know I mean, you can get in the weeds. There's so much that goes into what's led up to inequality between slavery and Jim Crow, and even the history of law enforcement and the terrible things that have happened throughout, the civil rights movement. And we could go on and on and on. And I think, for me, I haven't lived through that, and I'm in law enforcement, and the tendency is to just, this is how I see the world now. You got to forget about this other stuff. We got to move forward.
Yeah.
But this process, I have to acknowledge, like, these problems aren't forgotten. And I don't say I understand that to say I understand what you're going through, because I don't. But I'm here, like, I do want to listen, and I am willing to acknowledge where we have failed in the past. And I do want to move forward, but how do I get that voice, or who do I? I'm still working through, like, what groups do I talk to, or who do I interact with, in a way where, like, I don't, even this conversation could be offensive to people.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be offensive to people. Like, I want to be able to, like, speak freely, and, and maybe I'll be corrected in the end. Like, somebody will be like, hey, you said this, this, and this, and, what about this, 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 and this? And I need to hear that. Like, I want that feedback. And so I guess the short answer, the long answer to your question is, I'm still working through it, and I don't have all the answers, but I think if you want to humanize law enforcement, it's like, we do care, and we do want to find the right answers, and we're not pretending like everything's right and okay right now. I get it, like, it is not okay right now. I don't think the answer is to disavow police and just give up on us and throw it away. I think that's going to lead you down a path that's going to make things worse. When in a time when I think we should be trying to pull together, and my hope is that we will.
Yeah. Well, and this is really part of what this conversation is about, is giving space for conversation, because I feel we exist in a world that we don't really want conversation. We just want to throw stones and feel better about ourselves. And so I think to move forward with all those things that you've both suggested, it takes a patience and a willingness to hear and listen, and a willingness to allow somebody to use the wrong words or think something differently and guide them to a wider understanding. I feel like we've gotten into a culture that we think the best way to convince people of our thoughts is to cut them down and beat them up and shut them up, which in some ways is what has got us where we're at. And so this is why, part of the reason why I want to have this conversation, and I hope everybody listening is gracious enough to say, yeah, we all might say stuff where we go, I don't know if that's right or wrong to say, but the heart is we want to make things better. The heart is we want to do something.
Well, and he kind of alluded to as well, recognizing that there is a better to be made. I mean, I can't think of any society where there was never a better to be made or better to be had or something to strive for. And you see that, I'll play the devil's advocate. A lot of times, I've heard people say things that they're essentially downplaying or rejecting every claim of inequality, not necessarily just police brutality, but every claim. And you'll hear, I mean, I would be hard-pressed to believe somebody hasn't, if we're honest with ourselves, have you never heard somebody say something along the lines of, well, how can you say America's racist? Our last president was black. We can't be racist. Well, unfortunately, that's you're just pulling something very individualized and trying to apply it across the board. And my counter to that would be, I wasn't alive in the 50s and 60s, but I would imagine during the height of that civil rights movement, a lot of people went and said, well, how can they say it's not fair that they have to use a separate restroom? At least they're not owned anymore. They're free peoples. And that's just such a narrow-minded view. You're automatically just rejecting everything that they're trying to say because of some unusual or, conceived image you have of what equality is. And in reality, I think that we have to step back, kind of like he said, admit maybe I don't know the answer because I'm not necessarily the one who's being faced daily with these.
Well, and this is really part of what this conversation is about, is giving space for conversation, because I feel we exist in a world that we don't really want conversation. We just want to throw stones and feel better about ourselves. And so I think to move forward with all those things that you both suggested, it takes a patience and a willingness to hear and listen, and a willingness to allow somebody to use the wrong words or think something differently and guide them to a wider understanding. I feel like we've gotten into a culture that we think the best way to convince people of our thoughts is to cut them down and beat them up and shut them up, which in some ways is what has got us where we're at. And so this is why, part of the reason why I want to have this conversation, and I hope everybody listening is gracious enough to say, yeah, we all might say stuff where we go, I don't know if that's right or wrong to say, but the heart is we want to make things better. The heart is we want to do something